Birth control is one hell of a drug. It's one pill that has objectively changed the course of history, especially in regards to women. However, the pill's history is rooted in the shadiest clinical trials that have involved eugenics, racism, exploitation, and insanely shady clinical trial practices. I'm not Gabby B, and let's jump into it. A lot of people aren't aware that birth control has a very dark past. It is widely used today and seen by many as one of the best scientific advancements of the 1900s. The freedom for effective family planning changed the lives of women everywhere and allowed them to take control of their fertility and their lives. But how did the pill come to be? Especially during a time when even the research of birth control was illegal in most states. And no, I'm not kidding. 30 states had statutes prohibiting or restricting the sale and advertisement of contraception. The belief that these rules were based on were that contraception was immoral and promoted promiscuity. These initial anti-birth control statutes were fought for by a man from New York by the name of Anthony Comstock. He was a devout Christian, and due to what he saw in New York City, it spurred him to action to get rid of all of the immorality, such as prostitution and pornography in the city. I mean, if it would be one city, New York City would be that city, I guess. But he started supplying the police with information that helped them in raids against prostitution. And the presence of birth control advertisements put the birth control industry on his radar. And I love how it's always some guy who tries to force his morals on everyone else, but anyway. His belief was that the availability of contraceptives promoted sexual immorality. So, in 1872, Comstock, who became the U.S. Postal Inspector, started pushing for an anti-obscenity bill that included a ban on contraceptives. He himself had drafted this bill, and in my research, it says that he originally wanted to place a ban on obscene materials being mailed. But then Congress, when they passed it in 1873, had expanded that to include information on birth control and abortion. After this federal law got passed, several states enacted their own versions of the law, and some made it even more restrictive at the state level. New England had the most restrictive laws, and Connecticut was the strictest overall. The act of using birth control there was prohibited by law, and even married couples could be arrested for using birth control in their own homes. Luckily, law enforcement usually didn't necessarily do anything when it came to the anti-birth control laws. However, even though they weren't necessarily being enforced, they still were in place, and they were in place for a long time until they were finally challenged by Margaret Sanger. Yes, the founder of Planned Parenthood, that Margaret Sanger. So Margaret Sanger challenged federal and state Comstock laws to get birth control information and contraception to women. She was driven by her goal to give women the ability to control their own fertility and avoid unwanted pregnancies. She herself was one of 11 children, and she watched her 50-year-old mother die. Her mother had died of tuberculosis, but after 11 childbirths and 7 miscarriages, Sanger believed her mother's death was her father's fault due to her having too many children. Then, Sanger became a nurse in New York City on the Lower East Side, and there she saw many poor immigrant women resort to back alley, word that I can't say on YouTube, but after these procedures were botched, Sanger would usually have to care for these women. In 1914, she coined the term birth control, and then in 1915, she got arrested for mailing diaphragms, which is a type of birth control. Google it. I cannot show it here. Just letting you know. And in 1916, she got arrested for opening the very first birth control clinic in the US. Margaret and her associates were arrested 10 days after the clinic was opened for distributing prohibited material. She was released from jail after her bail was posted, but 2 days later she reopened the clinic, and so she was arrested again for violating the New York Penal Code due to the fact that none of the individuals working at the clinic were doctors, as at that time under the Penal Code, doctors were the only ones that were exempt from the Penal Code, restricting the discussion and education on contraceptives. Sanger and her accomplices were sentenced, and after Sanger was released, she appealed the court's decision. However, New York Appeals Court upheld that the original decision was constitutional, as Sanger had violated the New York Penal Code. Sanger had argued that the New York law infringed on women's liberties by forcing them to conceive more children than they wanted, but the appeals court stated that the law was not unconstitutional as it protected the morals of society. Not to be political, but I'm not going to say it. I'm not going to say it. It's okay. self-control. Okay. So in 1923, Sanger established the Clinical Research Bureau under the supervision of a doctor. And now, according to the law, it was one of the first legal birth control clinics in the US because it was supervised by a physician. For the next 30 years, Sanger spent her time working to make birth control available to the American public. Now, before we move on with our story, I have to mention that Sanger herself, even with all of this advocacy work for women's health and women's rights, is a complicated character due to certain views that she voiced on eugenics and race. Sanger is accused of racism due to her work in the African American community, as well as eugenics due to statements that she made about selective breeding to improve the health of humankind. And both of those are due to things that she wrote and said. There's a very good Time article called What Margaret Sanger Really Said About Eugenics and Race, and this article is about the statements and how they fit into the context of the time, as well as statements from historians who have analyzed what was said within the context of the discussions that she was having. I would go further into this, but I don't want it to take away from the original point of this video. I just want you all to be aware since she was pivotal to this entire thing. And I know you're probably all like, Gabby, Puerto Rico! And yes, I'm getting there. But if I don't give this background, you won't have any context for the event. So don't be impatient. It is a journey, not a sprint. By the 1950s, even with everything Sanger was doing to spread birth control options and help women, she knew that the options for birth control weren't that great. The diaphragm had been around for years. It was started in Europe and people used it, but nothing new had been developed. And due to how awkward the diaphragm was to use, it wasn't very popular in America. So guys, if you did look up a diaphragm, you would understand that it's just not, it's just not something you'd want to dabble in unless you really had to dabble in it. I don't know. That's just me personally. Maybe you love that, and I respect it. So anyway, she had the idea of a contraception pill. She had this idea for decades, but no one else was willing to take up the mission. So she started looking for someone who would have the knowledge, the ability, and the drive to look into development of this contraception pill. And in 1951, she met exactly that person, Gregory Pincus. So Greg Pincus was a biologist that was known for his research on the sex physiology of mammals. In 1934, he successfully carried out in vitro fertilization on rabbits, but this was not well received by the scientific community, and he was vilified as a Dr. Frankenstein for creating soulless babies. This was such a hit to his career that he actually lost his position at Harvard as an assistant professor. And after losing this position, Sanger, he ended up founding a private lab with one of his old Harvard coworkers, and they continued doing niche research. The thing is, after losing that job, it was Great Depression era. He had no money. He had to provide for his family. He started this position, this private lab, and he actually worked as a researcher and as the janitor to kind of keep things afloat. So just my fun fact. But then in 1953, when Sanger approached Pincus to develop a contraceptive pill, he took on that challenge. Sanger had acquired funding for the project from Catherine McCormick, who was a wealthy heiress. Also, fun fact about her, women of her status back then didn't necessarily go get their educations, but she actually was awarded a bachelor's degree in biology from MIT in 1904. But this collaboration would eventually lead to the development of the oral contraceptive pill. Now, here's the thing. When Pincus started doing this research into the pill, he was located in Massachusetts, which was one of the states that had very strict laws prohibiting research into birth control. But still, he and his partner John Rock, who was an obstetrician, they worked in secret. The idea that Pincus had for the contraceptive was to use progesterone. Now, progesterone is a very important hormone in the female reproductive system and the absolute bane of my personal existence. Progesterone really fucks me up. But anyway, this hormone is important to menstruation and in the early stages of pregnancy. What it does is it essentially prepares your uterus for an egg to implant and grow. But if you don't get pregnant, then you shed the lining that was prepared for an egg in your period. But if a fertilized egg does implant, then progesterone increases to support that pregnancy. Progesterone is produced by the corpus luteum, which forms after ovulation each month. And if no pregnancy occurs, then the corpus luteum breaks down and progesterone levels decrease. But as you can imagine, if a pregnancy does occur, then the corpus luteum continues to make progesterone until the placenta forms and takes over the production. So due to the importance of progesterone in pregnancy and cycle regulation, Pincus thought that it was the most promising path for potential contraception. He knew that there was a study showing that progesterone could prevent ovulation. So following this hunch, he and a colleague tested the effectiveness of progesterone as an anti-ovulatory in animals, and they found that it was incredibly effective. Coincidentally, right around this time, there were companies that had developed progesterone pills, but they didn't develop them for use on humans. However, Pincus convinced them to allow him to use them, and so he got to work with human trials. So, according to an article on the history of oral contraception in the American Journal of Ethics, this is going to be a direct quote because I don't want to mess up the important information, but this is what it says. The first oral contraceptive preparations contained 100 to 175 micrograms of estrogen and 10 milligrams of progesterone. This high dose caused many adverse effects such as deep vein blood clots. Keep in mind, the modern pill now contains only 30 to 50 micrograms of estrogen and 0.3 to 1 milligram of progesterone. So that was a massive difference. Now, here's where we get into the Puerto Rico trials. Gregory Pincus and John Rock had done preliminary trials on a small amount of women, and they hid the trial as a fertility trial. But without testing on a wider pool, there wouldn't be any way for him to get the drug approved. In the 1950s, Puerto Rico was the perfect place to test a contraceptive drug. Its laws were more liberal than those of the continental US, and there was already an established clinical network throughout the island. Far ahead of the mainland US, Puerto Rico established family planning clinics in 1935, and they authorized the teaching and practice of contraception in 1937. There are multiple reasons why this is the case: limited resources, economic planning, but also racial concerns. Its poor Hispanic population worried like a lot of the American overpopulation alarmists, which were a really big thing throughout the 1900s. I'm pretty sure I mentioned them before in another episode that I did. But anyway, on that note of overpopulation, eugenicist legislation codified forced sterilization. By 1955, 16.5% of Puerto Rican women of childbearing age had been sterilized. In a 1988 study of women who had been sterilized at the time, 16% reported that they had not made the decision for themselves. While already dark, many on the island justified these practices. As the governor of Puerto Rico wrote to Margaret Sanger in 1933, quote, "The tragedy of the situation is that the more intelligent classes voluntarily restrict their birth rate, while the most vicious, most ignorant, and most helpless and hopeless part of the population multiplies with tremendous rapidity." End quote. In other words, the population of Puerto Rico was deemed not intelligent enough to simply not have too many kids, and so measures would have to be taken against them. And that was their governor. So, funded by population control enthusiasts, enticed by lax contraceptive regulation, and welcomed by an established clinical network, Rock and Pincus decided to export the final stages of their research to Puerto Rico and develop what would become known as simply the pill. To begin, they started small. Celso Ramon Garcia, their colleague at the Worcester Foundation, recruited 20 female University of Puerto Rico medical students into an initial study in 1955, which very quickly ran into a serious problem: the dropout rate. More than half of the participants dropped out, infuriating the researchers. As one would write to Pincus, quote, "If any medical student exhibited irresponsibility of this sort, I would hold it against her when considering grades." End quote. Which is insane. Now, why would there be such a high dropout rate, you may wonder? Well, because the trial was quite taxing on the participants, as anyone who's ever dealt with birth control would know. According to the papers of Rock and Pincus, the methods involved considerable time and occasional pain, not to mention common side effects including blood clots, bleeding, and nausea. Everyday participants were made to take their temperature and a vaginal smear. Each month, their cervixes were dilated and tissue from their uteruses were collected. In some cases, women underwent laparotomies, a large incision meant to expose the abdominal cavity so that researchers could observe their ovaries in real time. They were, for all intents and purposes, guinea pigs, or like the rabbits that had initially been tested on. Either way, despite the dropout rate, the researchers would still gain valuable data. After this, the scientists left the medical students and prepared for the first official field trial of what would become the birth control pill. They created a prototype drug. All they needed were test subjects to actually try it out. The researchers chose the Rio Piedras neighborhood of San Juan, where a housing development had been built for neighboring farm laborers. The families selected were landless, and they were deemed to be part of the social problem that the island eugenicists went on about. Social problem. Poverty and immobility made the women living there perfect subjects for a controlled trial. So once the researchers had chosen the neighborhood, a memo from Pincus to Rock indicates that they recruited 265, this is a direct quote again, sufficiently intelligent women for whom, direct quote again, pregnancy would be acceptable or at worst inconvenient. End quote. This is something that needs to be mentioned. The study did not involve financial compensation, but they never had trouble convincing women to sign up, oftentimes recording that more women tried to participate than they had pills for. Though many elements of the trial were exploitative, most historians agree that the women participated in the trials to gain access to reversible contraception, which I guess for the time makes sense, but wow, it's really sad. One woman reported joining because she already had 10 kids, but her husband wanted sex every single day. This would be a way for her to take some control for herself. But as in the earlier trials, researchers had trouble convincing women to remain on the pill. Participation was arduous. For 3 months, subjects were made to take 1 tablet a day for the majority of their menstrual cycle and undergo regular testing. According to letters, social workers and doctors visited the subjects often, collecting vaginal smears on glass slides, recording side effects, and distributing tablets. According to Pincus and Rock's paper, 22% of women dropped out due to side effects, which remained severe. The pills contained much higher doses of hormones than modern-day birth control pills. As I said earlier, we're talking 10 times as much, which, as you can imagine, caused significant side effects. Pincus didn't feel that side effects like nausea or depression warranted a reformulation of the pill. Their only concern was proving its efficacy. Meanwhile, 3 women died during the clinical trials, but autopsies were not performed on their bodies, and it remains unclear whether those fatalities were linked to the pill. So, while the trials lacked any modern safety standards, for Pincus, the trial was a success. The high dose of hormones all but ensured trial participants wouldn't get pregnant, and in the field trials, the pill was nearly 100% effective, and they discovered some interesting things during the experiments. At one point, Pincus discovered that one compound had accidentally been contaminated with a tiny amount of synthetic estrogen, also known as mestranol. Pincus had always tried to avoid the estrogen, and when he learned of this accidental contamination, he ordered the drug company to get rid of estrogen, not only because he felt it might be unsafe, but also because he thought the estrogen might have been responsible for some of the side effects that women were reporting. To his surprise, however, not only did the nausea persist, but women began experiencing even more breakthrough bleeding. As a consequence, Pincus developed the idea that the accidental contamination might have been a good thing. With more experimentation, he found that breakthrough bleeding increased when the estrogen dose fell, and nausea and breast pain increased when it rose. He also discovered that when the estrogen levels were too low, the pill was less effective in preventing pregnancy. Now, instead of purifying the pill, he suggested that they intentionally make it 10 milligram tablets with 1.5% mestranol. The side effects did not disappear completely, but the bleeding almost stopped. Still, in the first months of 1957, the dropout rates remained high and the number of women enrolled in the study was low. Too low, Pincus believed, to win approval from the Food and Drug Administration. In an effort to remove emphasis on the number of patients enrolled in the trial, Pincus stopped talking about women altogether. Instead, he talked about the number of menstrual cycles observed. In the 1279 cycles, when the regime of treatment was meticulously followed, there was not a single pregnancy. Simply put, 1,279 menstrual cycles sounded a lot more impressive than 130 women. So go figure, data manipulation at its finest. And so the scientists forged ahead. In 1959, after additional trials in Puerto Rico, Haiti, and Mexico, the drug Enovid was put forth to the FDA for approval as a contraceptive. This would then take place the following year in 1960 when it got approved. After collecting the data, Pincus and Rock packed their bags and returned to Massachusetts, where birth control quickly became widely available. It was a different story in Puerto Rico. The original price of Enovid, 50 cents a pill or $11 a month, was far too expensive for the publicly housed laborers who had participated in the trials to afford. After months of enduring vaginal smears and more invasive procedures, most of the participants were left high and dry, denied both compensation and the drug that they helped create. American women, on the other hand, could mostly afford it and were willing to do almost anything, including go through side effects like spotting and the risk of blood clots, in exchange for discreet, inexpensive, and effective birth control. The hormonal levels of the drugs have gone down and symptoms have reduced today, but side effects such as depression or worse remain common. In the end, the pill was a success for its intended purpose, but it came at a cost physically, morally, and mentally to develop. But what more will be discovered in the future as technology and medicine progress? Who can say? But guys, that is the end of today's video. I know it was a very disturbing one. Birth control is great that we have it today, the way we got there. Wow. And what really gets me, not to be preachy, you guys could just stop watching now. Not to be preachy, but women, the effects of medicine on women are not really well known in medicine today just because of how they removed us from a lot of the trials. A lot of drugs were not fully tested on women up until I think the 90s or something crazy like that. But we have this. Yay. Anyway, bye guys. See you next time.